This one is All the Loopholes for Travel from Europe to Russia by Alf as Interesting.
So you want to cross the Russian border. Why? It's none of my business. Maybe you're visiting some Russian relatives, maybe you want a nice authentic bowl of Govyadina po-Stroganovsky, maybe you're a geography nerd who is sitting at home in a dark room watching YouTube videos about weird border facts on your phone with absolutely no intention to go to Russia ever. Whatever it is that's brought you here, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the Europe-Russia border, every possible way to cross it, and how we've ended up in a situation where the only reasonable way to actually do that is a single 10-seater passenger bus in Arctic Norway. First, let's back up a bit. During the before times, that brief period of history where the actual president of the Soviet Union was freelancing as an extra in Pizza Hut commercials, the Europe-Russia border was primarily and frequently crossed by air. Thousands of flight routes, instituted over decades, served as the fibers bringing these two regions together. By March of 2022, these routes had nearly entirely evaporated. Flights were suspended from all of the EU, the other NATO countries, and a handful of those weird little European countries that aren't in either club but are generally pretty chill. Does that mean you can't fly to Russia anymore? No, not really. It just means you've got to fly somewhere else first. Specifically, you've got to fly to one of these 40 countries. Each of these countries has at least one airport that still operates flights into Russia, and 6 of those airports are in Europe. Now, of those 6,
I was gonna say, obviously with the war, like, things have changed, but it's not like the country is closed off.
4 of them are in Belarus, and Belarus is too busy sucking on Putin's toes to let you in anyway, so in reality that leaves us with 2, Belgrade and Istanbul. Of course, you could also go to one of these other 37 countries, but that's beyond the scope of this unnecessarily specific 7-minute video essay, so I'm just gonna do what any responsible educator would do and simply pretend they don't exist. Now, this kind of flight hopping is still probably the most common method for crossing the Russian border, but it's expensive and incredibly time-consuming, so it's not necessarily your best bet. Instead, let's look at crossing the land border by train. And there are no trains. Before the war, plenty of rail lines existed. There was the Stryza from Berlin to Moscow, the Allegro from Helsinki to St. Petersburg, the Baltic Express from Tallinn, all kinds of stuff. None of these trains exist anymore, and this land border can't be crossed by rail, mostly. Excluding Belarus, for the same reasons as before, there is one passenger train that crosses the Europe-Russia border, but making it work requires exploiting a bit of a loophole. Let's talk for a moment about Kaliningrad, a topic that you people have officially requested a video about 371 times. It's kind of interesting, maybe even half as interesting, but there's not really a lot to say about it. Kaliningrad is a piece of land right here between Lithuania and Poland. From the end of World War II, it was part of the Soviet Union, technically part of Russia since Russia didn't want to leave such a juicy stretch of coastline under the jurisdiction of the dopes running Lithuania, but it wasn't a big deal since all these countries were holding hands anyway. Fast forward a few years to 1991, and now these countries are officially no longer holding hands, and fast forward a few more, and now Lithuania and Poland are in NATO, so those hands are all holding guns. Meanwhile, Kaliningrad is still just as much part of Russia as it was in 1946, but now it's just kind of awkwardly stuck in the middle of NATO territory. So here's where our train comes in. Russia still legally operates a daily train from Moscow to Kaliningrad, technically from one part of Russia to another, but this train route has to cut through both Belarus and Lithuania to get there. At one point along the route, the train needs to stop in the Lithuanian village of Kena for a technical inspection, and, though you're really not supposed to do this, a lot of people just get off the train there and wander into the EU. Now, of course, this route only works if you want to cross the border in this direction and are also unfazed by committing some pretty serious crimes, but is an option. Now, that leaves us with roads. There are plenty of roads into Russia, and most of them are closed, but not every single one of them. For the sake of my sanity, I'm going to break these down going from south to north, starting with Ukraine. For some reason, all of the roads from Ukraine into Russia are closed. They're probably under construction or something. Next, you've got Belarus. Plenty of entry points here, but none of them can be crossed without Belarusian or Russian citizenship, so those aren't an option either. Then up here you've got Estonia and Latvia, which do have 5 open, or at least partially open, border crossings into Russia. There are even private bus lines that, as far as I can tell, cross 4 of them. But, and here's the important part, that doesn't mean you should get on one of these buses. These border crossings, though technically open, are exceedingly unreliable. Dealing with Russian border security usually takes around 6 hours, sometimes up to 24.
6
often
hours?
involves handing over your phone to get inspected for illegal content like criticism of the Russian army, and can very easily end with you getting turned away or arrested. So while these are also technically an option, they do not quite qualify for the official half as interesting stamp of it is half as interesting's opinion that it is a good idea to do this. Heading further north, you've got Finland, who closed all their roads to Russia and deployed their twink president to the border to shoot you on sight if you try to cross this fence. And then finally we've got Norway, with an itty bitty bit of border all the way up here in the Arctic. Now, there's generally not a ton of, well, stuff around this border, and that's actually what makes it pretty unique. Over the last 3 decades, the Norwegians and Russians living around this border have effectively developed into a joint community. Locals often cross the border to find work, fishing vessels share the waters to fish and get repairs, and many new families end up with relatives in both Norway and Russia. Things got cozy enough that governments started issuing special travel permits to anyone living within 30 kilometers of the border that allowed them to cross back and forth without a visa. When other European countries started locking down in 2022, Norway realized that closing this border and destroying this extremely cute little Arctic fishing community would be a human rights disaster, and so they carved out an exception for a single bus, the Borodin, named after the guy who owns it, Borodin. It's not even really a bus, it's kind of just a big van, and it runs once a day at 1 p.m., carrying less than a dozen people from Kirkenes in Norway to Murmansk in Russia. Unlike the nightmare border crossings in Estonia and Latvia, this trip takes just 3.5 hours and is reliable enough to still be used on a regular basis by commuters and locals making daily family visits. That, as far as I can tell, is the only way to cross the Europe-Russia border.
Yeah, but from what he said, you would still not be able to get on it, right? Like, it's especially for the people who live on this area, so if you, like, some random foreigner comes in, I mean, you're probably not getting on it.
Or without surrendering your wallet, sanity, or whatever other freedoms not being in a Russian prison affords you. Do with that information whatever you want, as long as you don't tell the Russian border control that Half Is Interesting sent you. Now, seeing as you have once again spent nearly 7 minutes of your precious life learning geopolitical fun facts about international borders that are probably not remotely relevant to you, I can say with almost 100% certainty that you would love our sponsor, Brilliant. With most of the rest of the internet turning to mush, Brilliant has remained an incredibly reliable resource for learning any new math or science.
I'll pause here, but yeah, thanks to the sponsor for making this video happen. Okay. I mean, more of the story is like, it's pretty hard to get in. More than I thought, maybe. But at least in Europe, right? I mean, just travel to not Europe and you should be fine, I guess. That's the moral of the story. Very interesting. Good video. Good video. Very interesting video.